talk is titled The Influence of Place. This is me in Taiwan in 2003. And this is at the Inge Ceramic Museum, which is just outside of Taipei. And of course, there's a very long tradition of ceramics there. So here I am representing Canada. This is what I produced. The lanterns had to be 2 meters at least in one direction. So this is exactly 2 meters, in fact, after being fired. This piece is a 3-section piece, and there was a very long lead up to this, about 45 days. And then moving back to Winnipeg, about 2005, I started photographing the damage that was left when the floodwaters receded, and I've done so every year since. There's some very clear indications left behind, like this. The markings is what I was most interested in, and also the sheer devastation that occurs every year, and in particular, it was the trees that interested me. You can see the kind of impact even one pretty skinny tree can have, in this case on the cracked earth around it, but also, of course, there's many uprooted trees. So this was the first tree I made in porcelain, and it's called Uprooted. This is from 2007. I made it, in fact, in response to the flood, but also I had been asked to participate in a show at the Winnipeg Art Gallery called Subconscious City, where everybody was asked to make work that in some way responded to living in Winnipeg. And with each of these works that I'm showing you, there is a connection to place. In 2007, I was invited by Les Manning to be part of a group of Canadians that went to Fuping in China, and a very wealthy benefactor who have gotten together to create a pretty amazing place. Every country is having a museum built for them, a ceramic museum, and it's on the site of this tile factory. So this is the international studio, which is actually attached to the factory itself. And this is where 10 of us worked for 1 month. While we were making the work, our museum was being built. We were allowed to use anything in the factory. These are all factory molds. And as I said, it was a tile factory. It's one of the few places left that makes traditional tile for Chinese architecture. And on a trip to Beijing, I encountered this petrified piece of wood. It's hard to see, I think, but there is actually an inscription on it. And of course, it's on a base. And then going back to the factory, I again found these fragments of trees. I don't ever cut them down myself. So I made a series of trees from the stump I found there on site. This is the interior of our museum, and this was in November 2007 when it opened. That's a Fuping commemorative piece I made, also from a piece of tree I found on site. In 2007, I was actually living in Halifax. So coming back, I decided I would continue with the tree motif. And this one's called Waterline. So I was also very consciously working with that idea of how the trees end up with a very clear line after the flood waters recede, and that there is in fact a very clear marker. So the color change was important to me in this piece. And in Halifax, I don't know how many of you have been there, but there's Point Pleasant Park is a very prominent and large park. In 2003, it was essentially destroyed by a hurricane, Hurricane Juan. And by the time I got there in 2007, this is what it looked like again. Much of the debris was left, fallen trees, and then they're cut up and again left to be part of the eventual restoration of the park and the forest. So this is a tribute I made for Point Pleasant Park, and I finished this in 2008. It's called Devastatus Rememorari, basically meaning in Latin, translated to English, it's devastated and remembered. These are all porcelain, made in sections again. And here I started actually transferring text, in this case from the newspaper. That went out September 30th, the day after the hurricane occurred in 2003. Here's an example of the transfer I used from the newspaper print. And you can read a headline there, Devastation Worst Ever. And here the words Devastatus Rememorari and devastated and remembered are repeated over and over and layered in clay slip. And again, in this case, I've made molds from the actual trees that I found, the fragments of the trees. And here too, I've also embedded branches and vines, the things that the tree, of course, would have had when it was alive. I tried to give it some of that back. And the cuts also became quite important. And I started to feature the cut almost as a wound. Here on the left, it's hard to see, but again, the same words in white on a very subtle background. But also on the right, you can see that the trees are sitting in a bed of salt. I decided on salt because, of course, it related to the hurricane and all the seawater that also was contributing to the devastation of the park after the hurricane. And I used 400 pounds of salt on the floor. And of course, Halifax also uses copious amounts of salt in the winter. And I was also told that even before the hurricane, the trees were compromised already by the pine beetle, and that had weakened them. This is a museum in Altona, where I was born, so there was another kind of connection to place for me here. This is at Gallery 111 at the University of Manitoba, showing with Bill Pura in this case. And then the show went to Philadelphia to be shown as part of the NCCA Invitational exhibition called Earth Matters at the Levy Gallery. This is Sandra Black, a dear friend of mine and also a very well-known artist from Perth, Australia. We collaborated on an exhibition. Here she was visiting us in Winnipeg, and these are some of the pieces that we came up with together. I then followed her and went to work in her studio in Perth, and there was a campaign on to save what they called the Banksia trees. They're 100 years old or so, and they were threatened and in danger of being cut down. So again, I actually scoured the local newspapers to find text that I could transfer onto the tree trunks. One of my latest projects, unveiled in 2010 at the Beechwood National Cemetery, I was asked to create a commemorative piece for this new building. And this, for the most part, was built to accommodate services, in particular the young soldiers coming from Afghanistan didn't really have a suitable place. And this is a memorial center. This is called the Sacred Space, and I wanted to also use something that related to nature, something universal. I was not allowed to use any religious imagery at all. This is Tommy Douglas's grave with a gazebo, and I also used some text from some of the epitaphs, not anybody's that were personal, but some of them are in the public domain, like Tommy Douglas. And this is part of the military cemetery. Many people, of course, do plant commemorative trees in memory of a loved one. And I use that as my theme for my piece. There's also cultural areas designated, and I used a lot of the text that I was allowed to use, and did a transfer in this way. I photographed it and then reversed it, made a negative, and transfer the text onto my work permanently in ceramic materials that are fired. So here's two examples in my studio. And here's the forked tree, inspired by those beautiful forked beams in the sacred space. And here's the piece finished. In closing, I'm going to read a very brief artist statement written recently. This is for a show in London, Ontario coming up. Growing up on the bald, flat prairie in southern Manitoba, where every tree is strategically planted to provide maximum shelter or simply perpendicular relief from the relentless horizontality, I have never taken trees for granted. Now I'm making porcelain trees, informed by place and plight. Thank you all for coming.